Those investigating crimes today are lucky enough to have many cutting-edge tools and techniques available to them. However, crimes still go unsolved. And with this in mind, it's not surprising that there are numerous cases from the distant past that have gone unsolved to this day. In this episode, we explore a selection of the coldest of cold cases. We begin with what is often cited as one of Britain's oldest recorded unsolved murders, dating back over 150 years. 1866 was a challenging year to be a farmer in Forgandinny, Scotland. Perthshire was in the midst of a deadly cattle plague epidemic, and many of the country's farmers had seen entire herds slaughtered to control the outbreak. William Henderson's 54 acres of arable land and another 10 of pasture on the Freeland estate was his pride and joy, a sprawling agricultural operation of oats, barley and root vegetables, and a fine stock of cattle and pigs. William purchased the 19-year lease in 1845 with his father Andrew. The two men had uprooted their lives in Tully after the death of William's mother left both men unmoored. They'd relished revitalising the old farm and had quickly turned the neglected land into a profitable business. But in 1851, Andrew died suddenly, leaving his son alone to manage the Mount Stuart farm. Still unmarried, 50-year-old William relied on help from a domestic servant to carry out household chores, while he worked the fields and tended the animals alongside a few paid labourers. But in March, he'd fired his servant and desperately needed help. On Monday, March the 26th, he took a cart north to Tully to ask his older sister Janet if she could assist in solving his problems. Janet Rogers was 2 years older than William and had been married to her husband James for 30 years. Together, they had raised 5 daughters, 2 of which still lived at home while working as weavers in the neighbouring factory town of Stanley. William hoped his niece, Mary, would come to Mount Stuart for a few weeks until a reliable replacement for his servant could be found. But Janet herself volunteered, since her experience carving would allow her to help with an expectant cow on the farm. William collected Janet from the railway station in Perth on Wednesday and brought her to Mount Stuart. The farm was less than a mile from the small parish of Forgandinny, but felt splendidly isolated. A dilapidated 2-storey farmhouse was tucked behind a small hill, facing the main road and hidden from the north by a screen of tall trees. Mount Stuart was accessible only by a steep track in the hillside, making visitors a rarity. On Friday, March the 30th, William rose early to tend to the livestock before heading to the agricultural market at Perth. He shared a breakfast of porridge with his sister, who was planning to begin the staggering task of cleaning the old farmhouse. Before leaving, he told his ploughman, James Crichton, what he wanted to be done while he was away. Crichton, a 44-year-old labourer from Fife, had worked for William for 5 months, but their relationship was strained. At the end of January, his employer had taken Crichton to Perth to help with a delivery of grain. Once their work was complete, he sent the ploughman back to Mount Stuart ahead of him while he finished some other business in town. William returned home just before sunset and discovered someone had broken into the farmhouse through a window and stolen £3, a silver watch, and a pair of worsted cord trousers. His suspicions quickly turned to Crichton, and the farmer had been wary of him ever since. William returned to Mount Stuart in the early evening. There, John helped him unload his supplies before setting off for home. Heading to the farmhouse after his long day, William was surprised to find the door locked and the window shuttered. He called for Janet, but received no response. He eventually used the ladder to climb through an upstairs window and found his way to the kitchen in the dark. There, he saw several overturned chairs and a heap of bedding, that had been dragged across the floor from the small box bed in the corner. As he unfurled the sheets, he was confronted with a sight most foul: the bloodied and beaten body of his sister, Janet. William fetched the local constable, Alexander Cumming, and the village physician, Dr. Lang. The three men returned to the farmhouse, where Dr. Lang confirmed Janet was deceased. The procurator fiscal was summoned from Perth and arrived the next morning with a small cadre of police officers. Janet Rogers had been bludgeoned to death with an axe, and her killer had hastily thrown the bedding over the body. The murder weapon was found lying nearby, covered with the victim's blood and hair. Except for the overturned chairs in the kitchen, the house appeared undisturbed, and nothing seemed to have been stolen, though William would later claim that the farmhouse had been wholly ransacked and that money had been taken. Both William Henderson and James Crichton were arrested under suspicion and questioned during the 8-month investigation that followed. Each man claimed the other was to blame, but Crichton was eventually the one charged with murder. The case hinged on the testimony of Christina Miller, the domestic servant William had fired shortly before Janet arrived at Mount Stewart. Following her dismissal, Miller had lodged with Crichton and his wife in their cottage near the farm. She claimed that after Janet's death, she'd overheard him confessing the murder to his wife. At trial, the prosecution argued that William's suspicion of him following the burglary in January was righteous, claiming he had gone back for more on a day he knew the employer would be in Perth, but had been startled by Janet's presence and killed her. However, there was no proof that Crichton had been responsible for the earlier robbery, and Christina Miller's testimony was overshadowed by rumours that she'd been having an affair with Crichton, or that she'd hoped implicating Crichton would earn her job at Mount Stewart back. The jury deliberated for only 12 minutes before returning their verdict. Not proven. After his release, Crichton completed his term of contract on William's farm before relocating with his family back to Fife. William Henderson found it much more difficult to move on from his sister's death. He was eventually sent to Murray Royal Asylum in 1890, where he died after a period of sustained mental decline, claiming, until the very end, that James Crichton had gotten away with murder. The two men remain the only notable suspects in this case. William's conflicting stories about the state of the house upon his return would have been a serious red flag in a modern investigation. Did he and Janet argue over breakfast? Had he killed her, locked up the house to ensure no one found the body, and rushed off to Perth for an alibi? On the other hand, if William had been in Perth at the time of the murder, James Crichton would have had easy, unsupervised access to the farmhouse. He may have planned to steal a few pounds from his employer and been interrupted by Janet, whom he likely had not even realised was staying there. Janet Rogers' murder slipped through the cracks of an imperfect justice system and remains unsolved today. The Book of Remembrance at the Metropolitan Police Memorial in Hendon records the names and circumstances of the deaths of British police officers who lost their lives in the line of duty. These records date back to the 17th century. As you can imagine, there is no shortage of intriguing entries. While some are quite bizarre, such as the death in 1832 of P.C. Thomas Hart, who died by drowning after being knocked into the river while trying to catch a stray cow. Others died in more traditionally heroic circumstances, like P.C.'s John Birkmeyer and John Wright, who were both killed in 1844 while searching a burning house when the floors collapsed. But among these names, one of the most infamous is P.C. Fred Atkins, who died in 1881 at the age of 23. The Book of Remembrance lists his cause of death as being 3 fatal gunshot wounds received as he was trying to arrest a burglar. P.C. Atkins was far from being the only police officer in Victorian Britain who died while trying to make an arrest, but his unsolved murder sparked a push for police officers to be issued firearms, forever changing the field of law enforcement in the UK. Though there were few restrictions on gun ownership before the 20th century, their use was limited mainly to hunting and other recreational pursuits. Coach drivers sometimes carried pistols to defend against highwaymen, but the cities of Victorian Britain were widely firearm-free. While gaslighting had made its way to most areas of London, there was no shortage of dark places to execute an attack. However, most criminals preferred quieter weapons like garrotes, heavy walking sticks, or knives, which allowed them to injure or kill without attracting too much attention. While a police officer needed to be constantly alert for various dangers, firearms were not near the top of that list. Nor did many police carry firearms themselves. When the Metropolitan Police was established in 1829, it set out to police by consent, hoping to avoid any association with the brutal military policing of the past. Met constables were issued dull blue uniforms in stark contrast to the red worn by British soldiers, and instead of rifles, they carried short, thick clubs called truncheons. Some higher-ranking officers were allowed to carry pocket pistols or revolvers, but these were rarely used. The officer's only other weapon was their rattle, a wooden ratchet device that emits a fast, loud clicking sound to summon assistance. Despite the Metropolitan's attempt to appear as non-threatening as possible, the new police force was still regarded with much suspicion. One segment of society that welcomed the officers was the owners of large residential homes. Burglary was a pervasive problem in affluent areas of London, and the property owners often placed special requests for the Metropolitan constables to check the security of their homes. In September of 1881, a rash of burglaries in the Kingston area of southwest London prompted a request for special attention to several large homes, including the Knoll, owned by Justice of the Peace Harry Powles Keck. Early morning of September the 21st, the butler of the Knoll was awoken around 1:15 by a loud noise. He began a hasty search of the house, where he ran into the housekeeper, who'd also been startled awake. The pair eventually found Constable Fred Atkins lying on the ground in a corner against the front doorstep. He had been shot several times. 2 inspectors, a handful of constables, and an ambulance stretcher arrived at the Knoll shortly after 2 a.m, and the injured officer was taken to the Kingston police station and examined by police surgeon Dr. Roots. There, they discovered he had suffered gunshot wounds on the abdomen, chest, and left thigh. The bullet that pierced his chest had passed through his lungs, making death a near certainty. However, P.C. Atkins lived long enough to tell his colleagues that he'd been attacked completely unprovoked. He had been on the grounds of the Knoll since around 1 a.m. and had not seen or heard anything unusual in his examination of the property. He said, "Before I was aware of anything, I saw something like the gleam of a lantern, and then whispers, after which there was a report, and then I felt I was struck by something sharp in the chest. I turned to one side quickly when another shot was fired, and that's all I can remember." Officers were dispatched to examine the grounds of the Knoll, where they discovered the burglars had removed the iron bar from a ground-floor lavatory window in a dark recess in the side of the house. They found a lantern and chisel in the bushes below. Footprints could be seen across the lawn towards the main road. It appeared that the PC had disturbed the would-be burglars just as they were about to enter the house, and they fired at him from the dark and fled. Atkins succumbed to his injuries nearly 24 hours to the minute after he sustained them. At least 2,000 members of the Metropolitan Police attended his funeral in Walton-on-Thames, and a large headstone was paid for by donations from the police and the general public. But what Atkins' comrades really wanted was the arrest of his killer, and that pursuit would ultimately prove fruitless. The chisel discovered at the scene bore the initials FB, leading police to suspect a local blacksmith and farrier named Frank Brockwell. Brockwell's boots were found to match the prints at the knoll, but after hours of questioning, he was released. A £100 reward was offered, but no other leads were ever discovered, and Atkins' murder remains unsolved. Shortly after his death, calls for arming the police, particularly those who patrolled rough areas or worked at night, began in earnest. But it would take the fatal shooting of PC George Cole in 1882 and the attempted murder of PC Patrick Bones in 1883 before the Home Office ordered nearly 1,000 revolvers from Webb and Son to be issued to officers in London on night duty. The use of firearms by police continued to slowly grow, then exploded during the First World War. By the 1950s, the British police had once again disarmed most officers. But since Atkins' death, the question of what role firearms should play in British policing has never been fully settled. Today, about 90% of the police remain unarmed. But recent surveys show the public is overwhelmingly in favour of arming all police. Interestingly, metropolitan police officers are much less eager to carry guns. Nearly half think there should be more specialist firearms officers, but not that all officers should be armed. By the end of the 1880s, much of Britain would be obsessed with the Whitechapel murders, a series of 11 unsolved slayings in London's East End. During this period, it may have been easy for those in other parts of the country to believe that the horrific scenes they saw on the front pages of their newspapers could only happen in the busy capital. But in 1882, a brutal discovery in a small coastal town over 300 miles north of London would shatter that illusion. On March the 1st of that year, an elderly stonebreaker named Robert Moncrief took up his tools on the North Side Road in Workington, a small port town at the mouth of the River Derwent in Cumbria. Stonebreaking, or splitting rocks into smaller pieces to use on roads, was unskilled, back-breaking work, the kind of repetitive, monotonous job with little variation. But on that morning, as Robert began sorting smaller cobbles from a heap of stone, he saw something shocking. A pair of human feet protruding from underneath the pile of rubble. The old man moved the stones as quickly as he could, revealing the badly decayed and vermin-eaten body of a young woman. Given the advanced state of decomposition, it was clear that the young woman had been there for a considerable time. The body was discovered about 20 yards beyond a new bridge close to the roadside. According to one newspaper report at the time, the area was one where a considerable amount of passenger and vehicular traffic is daily carried on. How had no one noticed the rotting corpse until then? It was unsettling, to say the least. Without forensics to identify the body, investigators had to rely on other means. Thankfully, missing women were a rarity in Workington, and only one had been reported as such in recent memory. Lucy Sands had disappeared 3 months earlier on the evening of December the 1st. At the time of her disappearance, many locals believed she had simply left town in search of employment after she'd gotten into a terrible fight with her grandmother. But now, with a body matching Lucy's general description, investigators were forced to accept a grislier version of events. Lucy Sands was born in Antrim, Northern Ireland, in 1865. After she and her younger brother James were orphaned, she was sent to live with her grandmother in Workington. She was forced to grow up quickly, but settled into her new life as well as expected, finding close friendships with 3 local girls and working in the mills nearby. Sometime in her teenage years, Lucy moved away to take a job in service, but by 1881, she was back in Workington after being dismissed due to a prolonged illness. Though described as caring, generous, and thoughtful, 16-year-old Lucy was also headstrong and frequently clashed with her grandmother, who disapproved of her lifestyle and friends. In late November, she and her grandmother had a loud disagreement that was heard by most of the street. 3 days later, on December the 1st, Lucy left her grandmother's house around 5 p.m. to meet her friends in town. She never returned. An inquest into Lucy's death found that she'd been murdered. Her body showed marks of violence about her forehead and throat, and she was discovered without a hat and boots. On March 10th, Maynard Harrison, the 19-year-old son of a respectable tradesman, was arrested in connection with the girl's death. 3 days later, he was formally charged with murder. The charge came following the testimony of Lucy's friend, Jane Shannon, who said she'd gone with Lucy on the night of her disappearance to meet Harrison at the local ironworks. After showing the two young women around, Harrison invited them into his garden opposite the ironworks. After a short while, Lucy abruptly left, stating she had an appointment with a stonemason in Workington. Jane had left shortly after, but was unable to find her friend. Two servant girls at Harrison's house also testified that they had waited until midnight for Maynard to return until his father sent them to bed. At about 1 a.m, the girls spotted Harrison through their window trying to get into his own room from the roof of the wash house. A local man said that about a week after the disappearance, Harrison had told him he'd been with Lucy and two other girls in his garden that night and had made an arrangement with her to meet alone after the other girls had gone. Since the discovery of the body, Maynard had been acting nervous and had expressed to several people that he was the last person to see Lucy alive. Police searched his bedroom and found a 6-chambered revolver, though it was not believed to be the murder weapon. Harrison was brought before the Spring Commission of the Assizes of the counties of Cumberland and Westmoreland in April, but the grand jury declared there was not sufficient evidence to prosecute him on murder charges. Workington locals remained sure he was the killer, and rumours that his father's connection had ensured his freedom ran rampant. Shortly after his release, the accused was packed off to America to escape his reputation. As Lucy's inquest and subsequent arrest of Maynard Harrison unfolded, her story dominated papers across the country. It was called the worst reported crime against any woman during Queen Victoria's reign. The notion that a promising young woman could be brutally murdered and left to rot along a busy roadway for 3 months in a small town like Workington was deeply shocking. Although Lucy Sand's murder is still officially unsolved, 10 years after Maynard Harrison was acquitted, a deathbed confession seemed to confirm his guilt. Joseph Telford, who knew both Lucy and Maynard, confessed just before his death that he had helped Maynard Harrison conceal Lucy's body beneath a pile of stones after her murder. For some, this confession brought peace. Lucy's killer was known and was safely across the Atlantic Ocean. For others, it brought a frightening new realization. Justice is never assured. In the late 19th century, College Farm in Finchley stood as a shining example of progress in dairy farming. Founded by George Barnum and the Express Dairy Company, the farm embodied a bold solution to London's tainted milk supply. Centralised, hygienic production supported by a growing railway network. Opened in 1883, College Farm became internationally renowned for its state-of-the-art milking parlour, healthy livestock, and charming tea house where visitors could watch cows graze and enjoy fresh dairy products. It was both a model of agricultural innovation and a local tourist attraction. But in 1898, the farm's reputation was overshadowed by violence when its head cowman was found brutally murdered, a crime that remains unsolved to this day. Sometime around 1896, Thomas Webb and his new bride, Spier, moved from Middlesex to Finchley, where Thomas had been appointed head cowman at College Farm. Raised in hardship after his father's death, Thomas was poorly educated but hard-working and capable, with nearly a decade of experience in dairy work before joining the Express Dairy Company. The Webbs lived in a tidy cottage at College Farm, and Thomas oversaw 2 workers. Their days followed a steady rhythm: early mornings, evening teas, and Sundays at church. Though isolated from village life, Webb was well-liked and respected. Though monotonous, his life was enviable in a time when 35% of Londoners were living in abject poverty, pushed into overcrowded slums in horrific sanitary conditions. On the night of January 29, 1898, Mrs. Florence Pate was entertaining a guest at her home near the entrance to College Park when, at 8:10 p.m., 2 loud gunshots rang out. Minutes later, there was a frantic knock at the door. Sophia Webb, usually neat and composed, stood there in blood-stained clothes, clutching a broken lantern. "I think my poor Tom is shot," she said. Mrs. Pate grabbed her own lantern and rushed with Sophia to the Webb's cottage, while her guest was dispatched to fetch Mr. Mackenzie, the barrister next door. On the doorstep of the cottage, Mrs. Pate found Thomas Webb lying in a pool of blood. Sophia collapsed beside him, cradling his body. When Mr. Mackenzie arrived, they moved Thomas inside and sent for Dr. Harper, the local physician. Dr. Harper found no signs of life, though the body was still warm, indicating that Thomas had died recently. A bullet wound to the neck appeared to be the cause of death. Soon after, Sub-Inspector William Girling and several officers arrived. They found a cap, stick, and basket near the cottage. Following a trail of blood down the drive, Girling discovered another large pool of blood near Regent's Park Road. Sophia told police that Thomas came home at 7 o'clock as usual. Around 7:40, she spoke with the farm manager and the foreman, saying she and Thomas planned to take the omnibus to retrieve a repaired umbrella. The men informed her the bus had already gone. She relayed their message, but Thomas decided to catch the next bus alone after checking the cowsheds. He grabbed his hat and basket to buy some potatoes in town, leaving the cottage around 8 o'clock. About 15 minutes later, Sophia heard the front door open and Thomas cried out her name. He'd been shot, but he didn't say by whom. She ran for help, but as she moved down the drive, she sensed someone in the bushes. Swinging her lantern, she shattered the glass and fled in terror to Mrs. Pate's house. Strangely, Sophia also informed the detectives that Thomas had predicted his own death a month earlier. At Christmas time, she explained he had read a newspaper article about the murder of actor William Terrace, who'd been stabbed to death outside the Adelphi Theatre. He told Sophia, "I have a strong presentiment that one night when I am looking around the farm, someone will come out and shoot me." Police searched College Farm for hours, but found no weapon, no suspect, and no clear trail. As the Hendon and Finchley Times later noted, nothing could have been easier than for a man to have got away over the fields, for the spot is a very lonely one. Attention soon turned to 2 recent unexplained shootings in the area before Thomas's death. In one, a woman named Miss Matheson was attacked on a nearby road late at night. After escaping, she heard a gunshot fired in her direction. A month before that, a young couple resting on a bench opposite the farm reported a bullet narrowly missing them. Despite these unsettling incidents, police found no suspects or motive in Thomas Webb's murder. He was well liked, had no known enemies, and nothing had been stolen. Other farm workers, including a boarder who lived with the Webbs, insisted Thomas and Sophia were a quiet, contented couple. Though several suspicious characters had been spotted in the area, none could be linked to the crime. Scotland Yard soon took over the investigation, assigning Chief Inspector Henry Moore, fresh from the infamous Whitechapel murders, to lead the case. With such a seasoned detective at the helm, locals believed justice was only a matter of time. A post-mortem revealed that the bullet had entered through the left side of Thomas's neck, severing his jugular vein and piercing his trachea before lodging in the right side of his neck. The inquest opened on February the 3rd, with Spier testifying about Thomas's eerie premonition of being shot, but insisted it had no basis in real life. Her husband had no enemies and rarely left the farm. Titus Barham, the managing director of the Express Dairy Company, echoed her testimony. Only one man had left the farm under Thomas's watch, and not on bad terms. To explain discrepancies in witness accounts, Moore enlisted a gun maker to conduct experiments. Though locals like Mrs. Pate had heard 2 gunshots, Spier heard none. The gunmaker suggested they had likely heard a single gunshot and its echo. The Webb's cottage, it turned out, was poorly positioned to catch sounds from Regent's Park Road, especially when the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. The gunmaker believed the fatal bullet had been fired from between 100 and 250 yards away, possibly by accident, and suspected it came from a foreign revolver. He noted that very few marksmen could hit a man at even 50 yards. The inquest jury returned an open verdict. Thomas Webb had died from a bullet wound to the neck, fired by a person unknown, with no evidence pointing to intent. Though the investigation was never reopened, Webb's murder continued to capture the public's imagination. In 1903, rumours swirled that his killer had made a deathbed confession. Local papers sold out as they reported the claim at double their usual price, but the story was never confirmed. In 1908, the case stirred panic once more when William Stevens, the manager at College Farm, received a postcard warning. There is a plot in hand to shoot you dead one night or morning on your way from work. 4 weeks, police escorted Stevens to and from the farm, but no attack ever came. For years, the story of Thomas Webb was revived whenever a similar crime occurred or a new rumour emerged. But no suspect was ever named, and his killer was never found. It was as if he had foreseen the bullet meant for him, spoken his fate aloud, and then stepped quietly into it, leaving behind a mystery that would never rest. On a late September night in 1905, a railway inspector stepped into the yawning mouth of the Merstham Tunnel. It was routine work, walking the tracks by lantern light, checking for loose rails, fallen debris, or signs of tampering. The tunnel was just over a mile long, cold and echoing, the kind of place where even the familiar could feel unsettling. But what the inspector found that night was anything but routine. Lying beside the rails was the body of a young woman, terribly mutilated. At first glance, it seemed like a suicide, but when the post-mortem was complete, it became horrifyingly clear someone had murdered this young woman, marking the first homicide on a train anywhere in Britain. Her name was Mary Money, and her killer was never found. When Sub-Inspector William Peacock found Mary's body at 10:55 p.m. on September the 24th, 1905, she was lying 400 metres inside the tunnel. Her remains were in a bad way, to say the least, and local police struggled to identify the corpse. Not only was Mary badly mangled, but she carried no identification, no railway ticket, and no money. The body was moved to the Feathers Hotel, where a doctor performed a hasty post-mortem examination. Initially, Police assumed the young woman had walked into the tunnel to be hit by a train. But apart from the horrific injuries to her head and limbs, the body bore smaller wounds, scratches and bruises that indicated a struggle. And even more damning, the doctor found that a white silk scarf had been forced down the poor woman's throat. This was not a suicide. The woman had been brutally murdered. But who was she? And who had killed her? The following morning, police circulated a description of the victim, and a dairy farmer named Robert Money came forward to view the body. He identified her as his sister Mary. Mary was a bookkeeper at a dairy in South London owned by a family called Bridger. Robert had arranged the job for his sister more than a year ago, and she was given lodgings with other female employees on Lavender Hill near Clapham Junction. Mary's housemate, Emma Hone, told police that she'd left around 7 p.m. the evening of her death for a short walk, but never returned. A shop owner at Clapham Junction confirmed that she had purchased some chocolate a short while later and mentioned that she planned to go to Victoria. This was corroborated by a ticket collector at Clapham who identified a photo of Mary as the young woman he had seen at 7:20 p.m. It was the last confirmed sighting of Mary Money alive. The inquest into Mary's death revealed that she had no known male companions apart from her brother and had never shown any signs of depression or suicidal intent. She was a dependable employee and had no enemies. Mary had left home carrying a black knitted cotton purse, likely full of money as she had just been paid. The purse was never found. The guard on the 9:33 train remembered seeing a young man and a woman fitting Mary's description in the first-class carriage at East Croydon. He saw them again sitting close together at South Croydon. At Redhill, past the Merstham Tunnel, he saw the man exit the train alone. He was described as thin, with a moustache and wearing a bowler hat. A signalman at Purley Oaks reported seeing a couple struggling in the first-class carriage when the train passed through, but thought little of it. Apparently, it was common for couples to ride in the first-class carriage at night to enjoy a rare bit of privacy. Telling an amorous entanglement from a physical altercation was not always easy. It was theorized that Mary may have met some other secret male acquaintance for dinner the night of her death. As her autopsy showed, she'd eaten a meal about 3 hours before her death. Perhaps the man had then suggested a nighttime ride in the first-class carriage, during which there was a struggle when Mary refused to return his affections. If Mary was indeed the woman seen in the first-class carriage around 9:30 p.m., then her killer may have stuffed the scarf into her mouth to silence her during the altercation the signalman witnessed. Then, as the train carried on into Merstham Tunnel, he'd pushed her to her death before departing the train alone at the next stop. The jury at the inquest concluded that Mary Money met her death by severe injuries brought about by a train, but the evidence was insufficient to show whether she fell or was thrown from a train. Mary's murder has never been solved, and a shocking incident in 1912 added even more mystery to her death. The bodies of a man, his wife, their child, and 2 other children were found in a burning house in Eastbourne, all having been shot. The man, named Robert Hicks Murray, had shot the others before killing himself. Another woman had managed to survive 2 bullet wounds to the neck and pulled herself out of the burning house. She revealed that Robert Murray was really Robert Money. He had separately married 2 sisters, incredibly managing to keep it a secret from his wives. For years, he juggled 2 families before the pressure became too much. Robert killed both of his wives and their children before pouring petrol on their bodies and setting them ablaze. Then he turned the gun on himself, leaving behind a note explaining that he was bankrupt and could no longer support his two lives. After Robert Money's horrific homicide, police revealed that they had kept private information about Mary Money at the time of the inquest because they thought it would upset the family. They said they had evidence that she gambled extensively using money stolen from the dairy where she worked. They believed Mary, fearful of being found out, had thrown herself from a moving train. Police thought Robert knew about his sister's unsavory habits and had lied about her mental state to protect the family's reputation, pushing investigators and the inquest jury toward believing she'd been murdered. This revelation did not explain why Mary's body bore defensive wounds, nor why she would shove a scarf down her own throat. But it certainly shows that Robert Money, a proven liar and murderer, had known more about his sister's death than he admitted at the time. In the end, it may have been Robert's secrets, not Mary's, that sealed her fate. By hiding what he knew, he spared the family shame, but may have also silenced the truth. And with time, that silence hardened into mystery, leaving behind only unanswered questions echoing through a dark railway tunnel. There are few images more inviting than that of a family spending a stormy autumn evening gathered around a roaring fire inside a cosy cottage. On October 18th, 1913, Alexander McLaren, his wife Jessie, and his sister-in-law, Mary Spier Gunn, were the very picture of contented coziness. Mary and Jessie were knitting by the light of an oil lamp and the flickering fire, while Alexander read aloud from a novel. Cold rain lashed against the windows of North Bank Cottage, an isolated homestead nestled beneath the sandstone cliffs near Porton Cross in North Ayrshire, Scotland. But around 8:30 p.m, this pleasant scene was interrupted by the sound of 6 pistol shots. When the ringing of the gunshots faded, Alexander and Jessie were injured, and Mary was dead. The shooting drew international attention, but the murderer and the motive remain a mystery. Mary was one of 3 sisters born to Jane Spier and Gilbert Gunn in Stevenson, North Ayrshire. In 1901, Mary was living with her sister Jessie and her brother-in-law, Alexander McLaren, in Wigtonshire near Port William, where Alex served on the school board and built and operated Ebenezer Hall. When Alex decided to take a job at a post office in Tainault before returning to Porton Cross to farm, he and Jessie invited Mary to join them. However, Mary had no desire to toil over the fields and instead moved to Canada to live with her other sister. During her years in Saskatchewan, Mary had a passionate love affair that most assumed would end in marriage. But the romance fizzled out and Mary returned to Scotland. In May of 1913, Mary, Jessie and Alex moved into North Bank Cottage, where their tragedy would occur. By this point, Mary was 51 years old, and her sister and brother-in-law were a decade her senior. Ready at last to retire to a life of ease, Alex sold his sheep at a Perth auction for £100. The trio were not well known in Porton Cross, being new to the area and living in a remote and accessible cottage, but were generally described as respected and well-liked. On October the 18th, Mary went shopping in West Kilbride, just over 2 miles from North Bank Cottage. Later, Alex went out to meet her on a return journey. They passed a stranger along their route and walked with him for a while, making polite conversation. Later, at home, Mary and Jessie settled in to listen as Alex read At Sunwich Port by W. Jacobs. While they listened to the story of a disgruntled captain and his loyal steward unfold in the quaint coastal town of Sunwich, multiple gunshots pierced the air. Mary cried out, "Alex, I'm shot!" As Alex yelled at Jessie to drop to the floor, Alex, whose back had been to the window, had a gunshot wound to his left hand. Jessie was struck by 2 bullets near her kidney, and Mary was shot 3 times, the fatal bullet piercing her heart. Unaware he'd been shot, Alex rushed to release his dogs in an effort to catch the shooter, but he found only 3 sets of footprints and a few bullets. Police and a doctor was summoned, and Mary was pronounced dead at the scene. Jessie had a bullet removed from her back and was taken to the infirmary at Kilmarnock. With a hastily bandaged hand, Alex was taken to West Kilbride Police Station to recount the events that unfolded at North Bank Cottage. During their investigation, police found at least 1 fired bullet on the ground near the broken window. 2 more bullets were removed from the seat where Alexander had sat. They took plaster casts of the 3 sets of footprints, none of which matched Alex's boots. The murder weapon was identified to be a heavy caliber Colt-type revolver, but it was never found. Witnesses reported seeing an unidentified man in the area recently, where he'd visited 3 farms asking directions to Portman Cross, but he was never located. Alexander believed the killer was someone known to the family, since his dogs had not barked to alert him of a stranger nearby. The police supported this theory, noting that the gun had likely been fired from an acute angle outside the window, which indicated the killer was afraid of being recognized. Police concluded that Alex had likely been the intended victim, but there was no known motive for someone to target him. It may have been known locally that he had a large amount of cash from selling his sheep, but there were no signs the killer tried to access the house in any way. The murder shocked Scotland, with many feeling their next evening at home could be their last. Enterprising printers sold thousands of postcards featuring a picture of North Bank Cottage with a policeman standing guard outside. The investigation travelled as far as Saskatchewan, where police tried to determine if Mary's former lover had any reason to do her harm, but this proved to be a dead end. Jessie spent nearly 3 months recovering from her injuries, after which she and Alex relocated to Dalry. Mary Gunn was buried in the southern necropolis in Glasgow. Her murderer was never identified. Much speculation at the time placed at least partial blame on Alexander McLaren. One theory is that Alex had intended to kill Jessie, wanting to wed her younger and more attractive sister, but Mary had tried to protect Jessie and was killed. But this would mean Jessie had also lied and corroborated Alex's version of events, which seems unlikely. Another possibility is that Alex hired someone else to shoot Mary because he was tired of her constant presence. Her presence. That's a complaint. Firing from an angle in the dark, the shooter had inadvertently injured Alex and Jessie. Alex then manipulated police into following other leads, while the killer cleaned up all the evidence, tying themselves and Alex to the crime. To this day, no one has been held accountable for Mary Gunn's death, but the shadow of suspicion has never quite lifted from Alex. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or arranged for someone else to do it, many believe he carried the truth to his grave. Mary's murder shattered the illusion that danger waited outside the home. It reminded people that sometimes the real threat may already lay inside. Mothers in Edwardian-era England were all too familiar with the pain of losing a child. An estimated 1 in 6 babies died in their first year of life, and in 1905 alone, 120,000 infants in England and Wales died. Tuberculosis, smallpox, and scarlet fever ran rampant through London's slums, and even simple illnesses like influenza and diarrhea could be a death sentence for small children. By the time Agnes Starchfield left her abusive husband in 1913, she'd already lost 2 children in infancy. Only 5-year-old William, affectionately known as Willie, remained. If a child lived past their 5th birthday, their chances of reaching adulthood significantly improved. It may have even been the knowledge that Willie was out of the worst of the danger that gave Agnes the strength to leave her marriage. But in January 1914, her world was shattered when her son was murdered in a most shocking case. On the afternoon of January the 8th, 1914, a 15-year-old errand boy named George Tillman boarded a train at Midway Park after delivering a parcel. George sat in the 3rd-class compartment as the train trundled toward Dalston Station. Noticing his shoelace had come undone, George bent over to tie it. As he did, he spotted a tiny hand protruding from beneath his seat. Looking closer, he was horrified to discover that he was staring at the lifeless body of a small child. George bolted from the train at the next stop and reported what he'd found to the station master. The train was stopped at Shoreditch and searched, revealing the body of a golden-haired boy stuffed under the seat. The boy's face was suffused with blood, his lips were bruised, and his neck had marks that looked like they'd been made with a cord or rope. It didn't take long to identify the body as that of Willie Starchfield, whose mother had been inquiring after him at police stations and hospitals that afternoon. According to the devastated Agnes, she'd left Willie in the care of her landlady, Mrs. Longstaff, around 11:15 a.m. Agnes spent the next few hours looking for work, passing by where her estranged husband John sold newspapers twice on her rounds, once at 11:30 and again at 2:50. On both occasions, John was nowhere to be seen. When Agnes returned home around 2:55 p.m., Mrs. Longstaff and Willie were out. The landlady returned and told Agnes she'd sent Willie to the paper shop in Hampstead Road to fetch an apartment to let sign at 12:45, but had not seen him since. His mother next went to the paper shop where the shopkeeper told her she'd given Willie 2 cards for Mrs. Longstaff to choose between, but he'd never returned. Agnes began searching the area for Willie and went again to John's usual spot to see if he'd seen the boy. This time, around 4:30, John was there selling papers, but said he had not seen Willie all day. John Starchfield was roused in the middle of the night and brought to the Bow Street police station to give his own account of the day. John was not unknown to the police. In fact, he was something of a minor celebrity. In 1912, John had tackled an armed Armenian terrorist named Stephen Titus, who went on a shooting rampage in the bar of the Horseshoe Hotel, killing a woman. During the struggle, he was shot in the stomach and seriously wounded. He was awarded £1 a week from the Carnegie Hero Fund and was featured in papers across the city. According to John, on the day of Willie's death, he'd been in bed, suffering from pains associated with his bullet wound. He didn't leave his lodgings until 3:30 p.m, when he went to a coffee shop until 4. From there, John said he spoke to a few colleagues before picking up his papers to sell. The inquest into William Starchfield's death opened on January the 15th. According to the post-mortem examination, Willie had been strangled to death between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A length of cord believed to be the murder weapon was later found near the scene. John Starchfield testified that he'd been in bed sick the day of the murder, but his landlord was unable to corroborate this with much certainty, as he'd spent several hours at the pub himself and wasn't sure John was still in his room when he returned. A woman named Clara Wood testified that she'd been out running errands around 1:15 on the day of the murder when she saw a curly-haired boy eating a piece of currant cake while in the company of a heavy-set man with a moustache. Later, she identified the child as William Starchfield when she saw his photo in the paper. Wood was asked if she could identify the man she'd seen with William. She pointed to John Starchfield. Her testimony was compelling, as the post-mortem had found partially digested food containing current in the stomach. Another witness claimed he'd seen John Starchfield with a boy at Camden Town Station. 2 railway employees claimed to have seen a figure bending over a seat in the third-class carriage as it passed by, but neither had seen the person's face. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against John Starchfield, and he was taken into custody. At trial, Clara Wood faltered under cross-examination, giving the impression she may have seen a photograph of John Starchfield in the newspaper before she had identified him. She also admitted that she wasn't absolutely sure the little boy she'd seen had been Willie Starchfield. Another resident of the lodging house where John lived backed up his story of having been in his room until 3:30 that afternoon, giving his alibi more credibility. The judge determined there was insufficient evidence to convict John Starchfield of the crime, and he was acquitted. He maintained his innocence until the day he died, which happened just 2 years later in 1916. Many believe that John Starchfield killed his son, possibly by accident. Based on the autopsy results, it is believed that Willie suffered from a heart condition that would have made him more likely to die from injuries that another healthy boy could survive. Had John throttled his son and accidentally killed him? John's own statement to police points to another chilling possibility. He told police that his other 2 sons had also died, one at aged 4 from pneumonia at Charing Cross Hospital and the other at aged 2 at Bateman's Buildings in Soho. He was reasonably sure all 3 children had been insured by the Pearl Life Insurance Company. John admittedly took little interest in their lives. He had not attended his first son's funeral and did not even know the name of the second child who died. But if John Starchfield is to be believed, the death of each of his children would have resulted in an insurance payout. Many desperate families deliberately killed or failed to treat their ill children to receive insurance benefits. Had Agnes Starchfield, a single mother struggling to find work, killed her own child that day, stashed him in an empty rail car, and then rushed home to pretend to look for him? More than a century later, the brutal murder of William Starchfield remains unsolved. Whether he was the victim of cruelty, desperation, or something else entirely, the truth died with those who knew it. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.